Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first of a double bill today. And this special show is linking the First and Second World Wars. When the Third Reich invaded France in 1940, over 200 Commonwealth War Graves Commission gardeners stayed behind. Some were captured, some joined and assisted the French resistance, and lots of other stories. And The Caretakers is the book that my guest has written. The links to it are in the description below, as they always are. And she is here, and I'm welcoming the author now. Good afternoon or morning where you are, Caitlin. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
So we were just talking before going live. This overlaps so many different potential theme weeks on my channel. We have a shot down week. We have First World War. We have the interwar period. We have occupation of France. We have etc. 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 So, such a complicated and all-encompassing subject. How did you come to it, and why do you think it was important to bring it to the attention of the world?
Yeah. Well, I first came to this subject actually during the centenary of the First World War. I was in France at the commemorations, and on November 11th, I'm American, but I was at the Canadian ceremony at Vimy Ridge, and I was sort of looking around, and I thought, oh yeah, all of these places were here during World War II as well, right? Because there's the famous picture of Hitler at Vimy Ridge in 1940. And so I started thinking, well, what happened to these cemeteries and memorials during the Second World War? So I started looking around, trying to read about both the cemeteries and the gardeners who took care of the cemeteries. And that just sort of opened up this whole interesting, as you say, this overlapping subject of First World War and Second World War. I mean, I came to it actually from an interest in cemeteries. That was what my PhD dissertation was in. But thinking about the gardeners really does bridge that First World War and Second World War. Sometimes we can get very siloed in our interests and think like, oh, I'm a First World War person, or I'm interested in Second World War. But for these people, that was just their single lifetime. Right. As a young person, they served in the First World War, stayed in France during the interwar period, and then were caught up in the Second World War.
And also because I'm a Brit living in France, it's that bridging that gap between, we talk about what were the British doing in 1940 and what were the French doing in 1940. For example, there are people who had a foot in both camps. There were marriages that had always been going on of different nations, and bilingual couples, and the French husband and a British wife, or the other way around. And there's all sorts of people in Europe at that time who have a foot in different camps, and that's not even counting those with a German side and perhaps a British or a French side. That adds another layer of complication to it. But as I was saying to you before going live, when I see Commonwealth War Graves gardeners today, I never quite know whether to start the conversation in French or English, because they could be either or something else. They could even be Belgian or Australian because of the way the commission works. But we're going down a rabbit hole of discussing other things. But I'll bring up your PowerPoint, and folks, Caitlin's in charge for this, but fire away with your questions, because there will probably be some. But I'll hand over to Caitlin to take us through just a handful of the stories that are many and varied. I wouldn't be surprised if you found out more after the publication. It's the sort of thing that people would come to you and say, "Oh, here's a story you probably didn't know."
Oh yeah, absolutely. I continue to find more, and I just recently made contact with the daughter of one of these gardeners who's still alive, and that has been a continuous process of discovery for sure. And yeah, I'm happy to answer questions, so please just post them. So I wanted to start looking at one of these famous First World War cemeteries. This is Sayre Road Cemetery number 2, which is the largest British military cemetery on the Somme battlefield. So if you've been to the Somme battlefields, this is right near the Thiepval Memorial. You may very well have been to this cemetery. But many people who come to the cemetery never go around the back. So if you go all the way to the back of the cemetery, there are these two little chapels in the back there. And if you go around the back, you'll find this, which is the tool house. And that's where the gardeners, I mean, there's a little stove in there. They have their lunch breaks. But in 1944, this was a place where the gardener, whose name was Ben Leach, hid Allied airmen, U.S. airmen, RAF airmen, who landed, who were shot down on the Somme. And I actually talked to the children of one of these airmen, who gave me a picture of the same tool house. And this is a picture that Ben Leach took and sent to the American airman, whose name was George Simler. And on the back, it says, to Major George B. Simler, in memory of him staying as guest, ? at Sarah Road Cemetery number 2, 1944. So he stayed in touch with some of these airmen after the war as well. This is a sort of a June 1944 story, and I will return to June 1944, but I just wanted to give you a little background about who these gardeners were, how they got to where they were, and how they got to that 1944 moment. So in my book, I talk about 3 people in depth. There were over 500 um, Imperial War Graves Commission staff in France and Belgium during this period, but obviously you can't tell every story in depth. So I stuck with 3: Ben Leach, Bob Armstrong, who was an Irish gardener, and Rosine Witten, who was a shopkeeper in Arras. And she married a gardener named Bert Witten, who was from London. Um, but this is the area that we're talking about, this sort of northern France area, France, Belgium. This is a First World War map, so the sort of vertical line you see is the trench line,
Yep.
and then you've got the red line is the national border between France and Belgium. And so these yellow places are places where the War Graves Commission had offices or had large concentrations of gardeners. And the purple arrows are perhaps familiar to World War II audience, is the path of the German invasion in May 1940, right? Cutting right across the Somme and creating that pocket of cutting off the British and a large part of the French army and sending them to Dunkirk there. So you'll notice that these are also the places where British troops were in the First World War, the
Yeah.
Somme, Arras, Ypres. And so this is where the gardeners were concentrated. They were right in this area. And they were caught up in this evacuation. Now, what happened to the gardeners was that in France, the gardeners were ordered to stand at their posts in their cemeteries unless they got explicit orders from the local civil authorities to evacuate. So the War Graves Commission decided not to evacuate them, decided to keep them in the cemeteries, not anticipating that there would be any ground invasion in France, let alone one that was so fast. And of course, what happened was the local civil authorities in many of these places didn't order them to evacuate at all. You know, Ben Leach lived in Beaumont Hamel, right where Sarah Road Cemetery number 2 is. And, you know, it's a village of 275 people. Like there was not an official announcement of evacuation. Everyone just left. And so the gardeners had to make their own choices whether they were going to evacuate or not. So in France, um, half the gardeners were able to get to Calais and Boulogne and evacuate to the UK, and half of them were left behind. Things were a little bit different in Belgium. The commanding officer in Belgium did organize an evacuation, so more of them got out. But my book focuses on France, so it was half and half in France.
And what was their status in the 19s and 20s and 30s? That did they, you know, you said one was Irish, you wrote about, and British. I mean, they were retaining their former passports. Any of them acquired dual citizenship, or is it a whole variety of backgrounds?
Yeah, so they had a very ambiguous status, whether they were
Sounds like
civilian,
France and the paperwork. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. They had to keep their British or Irish or Canadian or Australian citizenship. They were considered to be on the service of the crown, right?
Right.
Like that they were crown servants, but they weren't civil servants and they weren't military. So they fell through all of these cracks of definition. So they were all veterans. Many of them stayed because they married French or Belgian women.
Yeah.
And their officers were all veterans as well. They kept their military ranks sort of honorarily. So all of the officers in charge were called, you know, Captain Mellis or Major Greensill or Brigadier Prout. All of the officers had those sort of honorifics. And they actually did think in 1939, they did consider drafting the gardeners back into the military officially so that they could operate more more efficiently when there was so much military activity going on. But they decided not to for a couple of reasons. First, because Belgium was neutral and they were worried that if they were in military uniform in Belgium, that would be a problem.
Yeah.
And also Australia, they were worried that Australia would object to having their citizens drafted into the British military because Australia didn't do the draft. That was a big thing. So they decided to keep them as civilians, but they did. It was a very ambiguous status for them and also for their children who did have dual nationality, but instead of dual nationality conferring benefits, it mostly meant that they were disavowed by both countries.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So Ben Leach is the gardener in Beaumont Hamel on the Somme, in that green circle, and he kept a daily gardening log, and so his daily gardening log tells us a little bit about what was happening in May 1940 as the invasion was happening. So on May 17th, his gardening log, the first question is panic. And it's a little ambiguous as to whether he's saying, like, should I panic? Are people panicking? Because this is the Nazi invasion of France, right? The roads are full of civilians who are fleeing. They're being machine gunned from the sky, from the German planes. And so Ben's writing in his diary about what should I do, but he affirms in the diary the last order of the Imperial War Graves Commission being for us to stand fast until told to go by the mayor of the village. And his mayor never told him to evacuate. And by the time he tried to, it was too late. And he and his family walked about 3 or 4 miles out of town and were overtaken by tanks and had to go back. So they spent the whole war in Beaumont Hamel just as civilians there. Now, as that's happening, some of you might recognize some of these photos. The one in the middle of Hitler at Vimy Ridge is very famous. So on June 1st and 2nd, 1940, Hitler took a tour of the old monuments of the Western Front, right? This is while the Dunkirk evacuation is happening, while the Battle of France is ongoing. He decides that this is how he's going to use his time. And he actually calls a lot of his generals to make this tour with him. So the first 2 photos there you have are of Hitler at the Menin Gate in Belgium. In the middle is Vimy Ridge, and then on the right side, well, my right, these are some photos that are less famous of Hitler giving a briefing on the front of the Vimy Memorial. Right, he's got a map up behind him. He's gesticulating. All of his generals are around him. And I think I have a comparison where this is happening. So if you've been to that memorial at Vimy Ridge, this is right on the front. The caretakers put a crate over the statue to protect it. But that's right where this is happening. So these places were here during World War II. They were taken over, and many of the gardeners stayed for a little while. But then, as British citizens, many of them were arrested and sent to internment camps. So here's just a group. These are a group of gardeners with their prisoner numbers. They were all arrested in July 1940, and they were sent to a camp called Illeg 8 Tost, it was in far eastern Germany. Now it's in Poland. But they were at this camp, which was housed in an old psychiatric hospital with about 1,500 prisoners. So it wasn't a very large camp, but about 10% of the people in the camp were either gardeners or their teenage sons who were also arrested and sent to this camp for many years. Now, this is a civilian internment camp. It's not a concentration camp. They're not trying to kill them. They don't have to wear the striped uniforms. They are allowed to wear civilian clothes. They're allowed to write letters, but the conditions are still pretty bad. It's very cold. They don't have adequate clothing, especially the first winter, because they're all arrested in July. So many of them only have summer clothes to go through the winter in Poland of 1940, 1941. They're supposed to get Red Cross packages, but they don't actually get Red Cross packages until they've been there for months and months and months. So they're starving. They have a lot of complications. And to remember, like, these are mostly men in their late 40s, 50s, and even 60s, right? They're all First World War veterans. Many of them are disabled or wounded. And so they're not in the same physical shape that most prisoners of war are. And so the imprisonment is quite harsh on them. And several of them did die in the camp. They're also, suicide attempts. They had a very hard time
Mm.
at the camp. And the Red Cross, actually, when the Red Cross did get to investigate this camp, the reports that they sent back to the UK were very dire and said, like, this camp is on the edge of moral collapse, and the UK actually considered reprisals against German prisoners in return for what was happening, like, keeping them in the same sort of conditions with
Well, that's what I was
let
going to say, because there's an interesting kind of diplomatic situation in that things could escalate very quickly, because there's these unwritten sort of understandings. Luftwaffe pilots that got shot down in the UK were given burials, and sometimes vice versa. So this treatment of these guys here who fall in this slightly odd categorization, that they're not serving military, but they were military, so they kind of represent the empire, the British and the Commonwealth, sort of. But they're not. But they're civilians. But they're also kind of half French, because they've got wives and kids. Some of them.
Yep.
There's different things that they could be used for, kind of for propaganda. So did the Germans did they kind of make any kind of press announcements about this, or make any statements, or was this all kind of kept kind of quiet?
Well, this was actually the same camp where the author P.G. Wodehouse was kept.
Right.
And so he very famously was used for propaganda, that the
Yeah.
Germans sort of plucked him out of the camp and put him on German radio, and that turned into a whole diplomatic incident as well. So they saw the famous author who was among these British civilians from France, and sort of plucked him out. The gardeners, as far as I know, I mean, they did eventually get exchanged in September 1944. So, like, very, way down the line. They're in the camps for years. But whenever we're looking at these in civilian internment camps, there are always rules, and then all the rules are broken. So, for example, with these civilian internees, they were not supposed to keep anyone who was under the age of 16 or over the age of 60. But the youngest child in this camp was 12, and there were
Right.
many men in their 70s. So, the implementation was not, like, strictly to the
We had a
letter.
similar thing with the people who were evacuated out of Jersey. There were kind of rules, but they didn't always follow them.
Yeah, exactly.
And a couple of questions that came in earlier, and Ian Carr is asking about were the gardeners wearing uniforms at the beginning of World War II? I mean, now I think of the green overalls when I see them there, but was there a kind of uniform they had?
Yeah, so they were not in uniform for most of the interwar period. You see photos of them; they're mostly working in shirt sleeves and sometimes waistcoats. They also had to have a jacket with them while they were working, because they were also ambassadors.
Yeah.
In the cemetery. So whenever a family member or someone would come to visit, they would put on the jacket, and they would, clean their hands and greet the person. That was one of the reasons that the War Graves Commission was very keen to employ people from all over the UK, Canada, Australia, everywhere, so that when families visited, they would be met with someone who, had a familiar accent, or
Yeah.
who had
Yeah.
a connection to home. They did have this discussion in 1939 about whether to draft them back into the military. They decided not to, but what they did do is they bought them all hats. So they bought them all these caps, right? Like the flat top cap with the badge. It's not clear whether they were actually ever distributed. Ben Leach, in his journal, writes about taking a trip to Albert shortly after the German occupation, and finding that all of the children in Albert have IWGC caps that they've looted from the abandoned office there. So they're all running around with the IWGC caps. They did have armbands, right? Green armbands with gold IWGC on it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So just briefly, I wanted to talk a little tiny bit about the two other people. So Bob Armstrong, who was an Irish gardener, as an Irish citizen, he was a neutral, right? Because Ireland was not at war with Nazi Germany. And so he was not on the list of people who were arrested automatically for being an enemy alien, because he was a neutral. So he did not go to the internment camp. He stayed free, but he was very active in the resistance from a very early date, right from the summer of 1940, when he was helping British soldiers who had been left behind at Dunkirk. He was helping them escape. And there's a wonderful telegram from some of the soldiers that he helped, thanking him for his help in escaping. He also helped several American airmen. Oh, this is a picture of his cemetery. So he was a gardener in Valenciennes, which is like sort of to the east on the Belgian border, east of the the main corridor of cemeteries there. This is the funeral of a special duties squadron that crashed in October of 1942, and the French civilians just decorated the graves with flowers, so many flowers, just rafts of flowers. And you can see the placards. We have what's written on the placards. Of one of the civilian French gardener wrote down what was on the placard. So they say, like, honor to heroes, thank you for saving us, this sort of thing. And so after this happened, the Germans confiscated all of those. They took the flowers and put them on the graves of some of their German shepherds, the dogs that the resistance had killed, and they banned people from the cemetery. So this is just a photo of one of the outpourings of support that French civilians showed to the Allied dead under the occupation. Yeah, because it was a way that people could show support that was a little bit safe. I mean, it wasn't safe, but it was a little bit safer. This decoration is actually on All Saints Day, so November 1st. The crash was like a week before, and they came to the cemetery with flowers, as French people did every All Saints Day, but instead of putting them on their relatives' graves, they put them on the RAF graves here. And these graves are still there. You can see in the background the CWGC graves, and these are now in the first row of that cemetery. Yeah. These are a couple of the guys that that Bob Armstrong helped. In the single photo, this is Arthur Cox. He's from Tennessee. And it's a little bit hard to see in this photo, but in the original photo, one of the things you can see is that the coat that he's wearing is too large for him. And the buttons are not in the middle. They've been moved and pulled all the way over to the pocket so that the coat is made to be smaller. And later,
so turning a single breast into a double breasted,
exactly, yeah. And later, when Bob Armstrong was captured and tried, in his trial, one of the things that he admits to is giving Arthur Cox his coat, his coat, so that he could. And this is the coat that he wore during his whole evasion, his walk over the Pyrenees back to the UK. The French civilians often complained that it was difficult to dress the American and RAF guys because they were young, they were big, they were tall, and they didn't have a lot of extra clothes of any size, of course, in occupied France. But they particularly struggled with these young guys. You can see in the other photo, the other guy, Maurice Wilson, is wearing a coat that's much too small for him, which is sort of part of this problem. But Arthur Cox had Bob Armstrong's jacket. Armstrong was eventually captured, and he was sentenced. Initially, he got a death sentence, but that was commuted possibly through the intervention of the Irish government. That's not exactly clear, but his sentence was commuted to, I think, like 15 years of hard labor. He was sent to a prison in Germany. And so this is a picture of him on his admission to one of the prisons in Germany. He was a wounded veteran. He was wounded on the Somme as a young man. And the wound that he had suffered and that at that time, reopened under these conditions, living in the prison. And he died in December 1944 in the prison there.
He looks awful in that photo. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit difficult to reconstruct everything that happened to him, obviously, because so many of the people who were with him did die. But there are a few bits of testimony from people who were imprisoned with him, and we also have the records of his trial. And I also found a memoir by the cellmate of one of his co-defendants that sort of gives a little bit of context to what they were going through. They were all tortured by the Gestapo. Actually, the guy the Gestapo officer who tortured them was named Kurt Kohl, and he was actually killed during an arrest, trying to arrest a French resistance member. And so they all talk about the celebrations in the prison when this Gestapo officer sister was killed. But yeah, I mean, Bob was very badly beaten and, you know, starved, and his body was cremated along with other prisoners. I also want to tell a little bit about Rosine Witten. So Rosine was born in Arras. She was a local, and she owned a Cafe Tabac, like a little corner store that was right between the War Graves office and the War Graves workshop. So if you've ever been to Arras or to the CWGC experience in Boran, where you can see the carpenters and the stonemasons, her office was right, her store was right near there. And so, she met many of these men. She was a child refugee during the First World War. Her family had to leave Arras, but they came back and they helped with the rebuilding. And she eventually married a war gardener named Bert Witten, who was from London and was an RAF veteran. So he was one of the guys who was arrested and sent to the internment camp. But Rosine stayed behind in Arras, and she helped many, many airmen. She was a senior guide on the Comet line, which is one of the big escape lines in this. And actually, it's so funny. I was watching Masters of the Air, and there was someone, I was like, I know that person's name. Why do I know that person's name? And I looked, and I was like, oh, he's one of the guys that Rosine Witten helped after he had been shot down. So Roy Clater, who's, a cast named person in Masters of the Air. I was like, where is that name familiar to me? But yeah, he was one of the guys that she helped. And these are two of the others, Doug Hohen, who's US, and Alfie Martin, RAF. She kept them in her house, and then she brought them to Paris on the train, where she worked with the Comet line.
And it makes complete sense that these staff members, she's a cafe owner, but they would have exactly the kind of knowledge that we need, the bilingual, know the roads, know how to travel between places. Because, we all know that there are lots of places in rural France where the locals just didn't travel. They didn't necessarily know how to travel across the sides of the country, because that's not what your life consisted of. You're a French farmer. A long trip was 5 miles to market once a month or something. So I've never been telling your book. I never thought about the fact that these people have all the skill sets that are incredibly useful at this time.
Absolutely. The bilingual thing was absolutely essential. So many of the wives and the teenage children who were not interned helped with interrogating people, because you had to make sure that the airman was authentic. And you're absolutely right about sort of that network, right? Because they were people who had community. They had been together for, they would have like British Legion events and commemorations. So their community, they knew people in a wide,
an extended community rather than a small kind of local community. Exactly. Just by the definition of the fact that they traveled around these cemeteries, they would know people in multiple villages, multiple towns. They'd know probably the bus routes, the train routes, and it's it sounds like it should be something that everybody knew, but it's it's not back that time. It's people knew the little world they lived in.
Absolutely. And it sort of created this sort of invisible map, right, of these connections. The first photo that I showed of the tool house at Sayre Road number 2, the American airman who stayed there, George Simler, who that photo was for, Ben Leach helped him, but then he passed him on to the wife of another CWGC person, Irma Palin, who lived a few towns over. And then she passed him on to Arthur Richards, who was the president of the British Legion in Arras, who wasn't in a camp because he was older. And he was a big hub of collecting information, making false documents, because they had this network that extended from the towns all the way out into all of these small villages. And they all knew each other and trusted each other, which was, of course, such an important part of any resistance movement, was knowing who you could trust. And they knew that these families, these Anglo-French families that, were very committed to the alliance, very committed to each other, they knew they could trust them. And so that was essential.
Ian sort of made a question stroke comment about perhaps the Germans will be largely inclined to ignore the Allied cemeteries, making them fairly safe to high prisons. Because, we know that when the French occupy Germans occupy lots of French towns, of course they would take down the French flags and put their own flags up and turn their buildings into administrative areas, things like that. But they would have known the French have a very particular respect for cemeteries. You talk about All Saints Day and flowers. So I would imagine, from what I know in Normandy, they would be very careful to kind of not just piss off the locals by, parking their tanks over graves, either French graves or Commonwealth graves, because it would just anger the locals. So is there some truth to the fact that Germans would tend to avoid the cemeteries?
Yeah, they did tend to, or just visit them as a visitor, right?
Yeah.
You'd see a lot of, especially the cemeteries that had German graves in them, you'd see a lot of that. And also in part because of Hitler's, repeated trips to First World War sites,
Yeah.
that became sort of an approved activity for young soldiers in France. France was already seen for German soldiers as sort of a light posting. And so it was really common for officers to take groups of young soldiers out on these outings to places like Thiepval or the Menengate. And so if you look at ordinary German soldiers' photo albums, there are very often photos of them in some of these cemeteries or at these memorials, because it was seen as sort of like like an acceptable activity that an officer would be in charge of, rather than whatever other things they might get up to on their own time. So Ben Leach does talk a little bit in his diary about meeting German soldiers in cemeteries, and the only time he says that anyone did any damage, other than, right at the beginning, of course, there were some, the Germans did take down some monuments, right? Did take down like the Australian monument at Mont Saint-Quentin, and some of the other monuments that they found objectionable. They did take those down. And Ben Leach does talk about visiting those sites and seeing the ruined monuments. But in the cemeteries themselves, the only time he talks about damage is there was one German soldier who got drunk and fired his gun into one of those little chapels, like into the ceiling, and all the plaster fell down and injured him. And after that, the local Germans in Beaumont Hamel mostly, left the cemetery alone. Yeah.
This is really fascinating, and it's presenting that we did a show where we talked about that travel actually increases in some parts of the world in World War II, and of course, with some of these German soldiers, their fathers, their uncles would have served in those same areas in World War II, so they're doing war tourism like people do war tourism today. It's weird to think that would be happening in the middle of a war, but I mean, I guess it did. I guess you're posted somewhere. As you say, you've got leave as a German soldier. Why not investigate and look at what had happened a generation before? It sounds odd, but it isn't odd when you think about it.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. War tourism happening during the war. That for sure. That's definitely
brilliant stuff. I can't tell you how much I'm enjoying this.
Well, Rosine Witten, eventually there was a crackdown in Arras and she had to move to Paris, but she kept working for many months. She was a senior guide on the Comet Line. She trained other guides. She had many aliases, and eventually, so she lived at Comet Line headquarters in Paris, and eventually that was raided and she was arrested. And she was sent to Ravensbrück, the concentration camp for women in Germany, and then later sent to a sub camp as a slave laborer. So she worked in a munitions factory, sort of ironically, making anti-aircraft munitions in this sub camp. But she did survive the war. She was badly wounded in the camp. Someone who was working near their job was to take defective shells and break them down into component parts so that they could salvage any part of the shell that was still usable. And obviously that was very dangerous. And someone near her, the shells exploded and killed that worker. And Rosine Witten was badly injured and had, lifelong disabilities from that, and from being in the camp and starving, and, all the other deprivations that go with being a concentration camp prisoner.
Wow.
This is her uniform, which is on view in a small museum on the Somme. So if you're ever around Beaumont Hamel and you visit Avril Williams Museum in Auchinvillers, there's Rosine Witten's uniform is there. She didn't have any children. She gave the uniform to a local historian.
Right.
And I just her husband, if you look in this array, her husband is the first one, number 304. That's her husband, Bert.
Right.
So he was in the internment camp. Most of the prisoners were exchanged in September 1944, but there was a mix-up in the number of prisoners in the exchange, and they ended up having to leave off 2 people, and they just went alphabetical. So last name Witten and last name Young were left behind, and so he wasn't repatriated to the UK until March 1945. So very late in the war. He went.
And we had a question from Ian earlier about which route were they when the exchange happened. Which route did they go via?
Yeah, so in the fall of 1943, they were sent from Tostes to a different camp in France. And from that camp in France, they were sent to Sweden and then repatriated from Sweden to the UK.
Right,
So,
thank you.
yeah, yeah. So I think they landed in Liverpool in September 1944. Yeah, but not Bert. Bert was still left behind, and he didn't get back until March 1945. He went directly into the hospital. He was ill, and he had an operation, and he never recovered from the operation. So he died in the hospital in August 1945, just a couple of days after VJ Day. So Rosine was able to bring his body back to Arras. They're buried in her family plot in the Arras Communal Cemetery. He doesn't have a CWGC headstone. The rules about who counts as a civilian victim of the war are a little bit fuzzy. You know, if he had died in the camp, he would definitely be on the Roll of Honor. But since he died after he had been repatriated, he's not on it. Could a case be made that he could be on it? Maybe. But you'll see that on the grave that Rosine made sure that it says IWGC on his, and that his line is in English, not in French.
Yeah.
Yeah. Next to her name, you'll notice some of her many medals. So she got, she was a officer of the Legion of Honor. She got the American Congressional Medal of Freedom, all of the British awards. These I think are just her French medals next to her name. But she lived until 1995 and actually worked. She was a stewardess on the cross-channel ferry for many years. So if you took the ferry in the 60s or 70s, you might have met her without knowing. She was.
What a history.
Yeah. But I did want to sort of come back to sort of the June 1944 moment and Ben Leach, because I know that it's
That's
June.
what we're covering. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So June 1944. So a slightly post D-Day story. So this story takes place on June 27th, 1944. So 3 weeks after D-Day. And it involves this tool shed and this guy. So this is Brigadier General Arthur Vanneman. He's the chief of intelligence of the 8th Air Force. So the 8th Air Force, the force that's stationed in England, sending over bombers, all of that. And Arthur Vanneman is, he's the chief of intelligence for the whole 8th Air Force. He's briefed on everything. He's briefed on Ultra. He has all of the information. But he decides that his men won't respect him unless he's been on combat missions. And so he decides that he's going to go on 5 combat missions as an observer, which is the number that you need to get an air medal. And so then he'll have the air medal. And so then when he's talking to people, they'll see he has the air medal and they'll know that he's been on these combat missions. And he got permission from Jimmy Doolittle, his commanding officer, to do this. And so 3 weeks after D-Day, he's on a B-17 with these guys. So this is the crew of a B-17 called Big Barn Smell. And your regular U.S. 8th Air Force guys, including this guy who's Donald Rentschler from Indiana. And what happens on this trip? They're just supposed to go and bomb a V-1 rocket site in northern France and come right home. But as you might imagine, since I'm telling you this story, that doesn't go to plan. They're hit by flak. The engine's on fire. The pilot tells everyone to bail out. And so 5 of them are able to bail out. The general bails out, Donald Rentschler, the navigator, and the bombardier, and 2 others. So there are 5 on the ground and 5 in the plane. And then the fire in the engine goes out and the plane recovers. And the pilot is able to get back to the UK. And I was able to talk to his sons, and they gave me an unpublished memoir that he wrote about. Oh, and a lot of it is about sort of this trip back without the general, and sort of calling to the tower. What does he say to the tower? Right? He says, I want to land right away. And they say, do you have wounded on board? And he says, no, I don't. And they said, well, just wait your turn, just circle. And he has to tell them something's wrong, but he doesn't want to say anything over the open channel, right? He doesn't want to say anything, that could get anyone in trouble. And so he finally says to them, I am the only officer on board. And they take a minute, and then he says, the headphones vibrated away from my head. As they said, what did you say? And they bring him in for the landing. And so he had left Arthur Vanneman, the chief of intelligence, on the ground in France. So on the ground,
the sidebar has gone, wild about what a stupid idea to let a guy with all that security clearance go there just so he can get a medal. Don't want to speak ill of the guy, but potentially, as Great Dominion says, a really bad idea to let a guy like that fly of enemy territory. So, that's the consensus in the sidebar.
Yeah. Well, Jimmy Doolittle himself had flown on D-Day, right?
True.
He flew and so he was someone who was inclined to give this sort of permission. One thing that I looked for a lot that I wasn't able to find a good quote about, but so after this happened, Lord Tedder took Jimmy Doolittle into an office for 2 hours and just shouted at him. And I looked in Tedder's memoirs and everything, but this was still secret when a lot of these people were writing about this. So I didn't get any specifics about what was said in that meeting, but I imagine nothing good.
2 hours is quite a lengthy reprimand, isn't it?
Yeah. So the RAF was
what a come down for Doolittle. I mean, we've done it talked about Doolittle on the channel before. I mean, he was in 42 post the Doolittle raid. I mean, he was riding a crest of fame that the 2024 can't understand, but in the US particularly, and then now he's being reprimanded for this. It's amazing how things change. Fascinating story.
Yeah. So Vanneman's on the ground. He's a brigadier general, and he's picked up. They land in a tiny little village. And so the local people who are, there's like a German captain in charge, and they bring him to the local, to the mayor's office. They're not even a jail in these places. And so they're interrogating him. They don't know that he speaks German. So Vanneman was actually the US Air Force attaché to Berlin from 1937 to 1941. So he had met all of the Nazi high command. He had met all of the aircraft manufacturers. He spoke German. So he could hear what they were saying. And they were very confused because he was saying he was a brigadier general. And they're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And then he was saying, I was in a plane that was shot down. And they're like, no plane crashed. So they're very confused about what's going on. And so they eventually just send him off first to a hospital in Frankfurt because he was injured in the jump, and then later to Stalag Luft 3, not trusting anything that he said. They didn't even really interrogate him very closely because they thought that he was there to give misinformation. And when he got to Stalag Luft 3, the prisoners there thought that he was there to arrange an escape, which he also was not. So he disappointed them as well. But the other 4 guys who were in the plane and landed in these little villages on the Somme were helped by Ben Leach and this network of CWGC gardeners and their friends and neighbors. So Donald Rentschler, the navigator here, this is just a clip from his escape and evasion report. So when they got back to the UK, they had to go through an interrogation and give a report about what happened to them. And so he's writing about how the English gardener from the military cemetery helped him, and they've got Ben Leach's name in the margins there. So Donald Rentschler and the other guys from the plane were in Beaumont Hamel and the surrounding villages for weeks. And part of the thing about D-Day was that all of the escape lines were broken, right?
Yeah.
Because the trains are not running anymore. A lot of airmen are actually joining resistance forces and fighting in a different way. But there's no way to get them out. And so what's happening on the Somme in June of 1944 is just this elaborate shell game of moving these evaders around from one place to another as the Germans, and this is, it is incredible to me, the amount of effort the Germans put into trying to find these guys, even in June and July of 1944. Like they're sending manpower to look for these guys. And so they have to keep moving them. And one of the places that they use is the tool shed at Sierra Road Cemetery number 2. And Donald Rentschler actually also, he spends some time there in the cemetery, but he also spends 6 nights at the Newfoundland Memorial Park in Beaumont
Wow.
Hill. So if you know the caribou,
Yeah.
and the old trenches there. So there was an incident where a local resistance person who actually did work for the CWGC as a French laborer, a guy named René Mouchemble, was shot by the Nazis in July 1944. And that made everyone very nervous. So a lot of people who had been hosting stopped hosting, and Ben Leach had all of these airmen on his hands and he didn't have anywhere to put them. So Donald Rentschler and an RAF guy ended up in the trenches at the Newfoundland Memorial Park for 6 nights before he could move them along to somewhere a little bit safer. Yeah. This is some of them at the Liberation. This is several of these. I mean, these are, Americans and RAF guys and everything, but 2 of the guys in here are from that plane. And they were staying with a woman whose husband was a photographer. So she took this photo, or he took the photo of them all on, I think this is September 2nd, 1944, with the liberation of Lille. And I really love the little dog in the front who looks very alarmed, because they must have been shouting really loud while they were taking the photo, because the dog looks pretty startled.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the book. I mean, in the book I do get a lot more into sort of the interwar community of the gardeners, sort of how they formed a union, how they were compensated, all of sort of that sort of thing. But I'm happy to answer if there are any more questions about either about the gardeners or about their experience in World War
Yeah,
II.
we've got a couple already. So you've given us a handful of stories. So some were interned, some were helping the resistance. I mean, did some of the gardeners just were able to kind of keep under the radar and keep on working anyway, and just sort of not annoy the Germans?
Yeah, so there were a few who did, mostly who were Irish, right? So there were a couple of other Irish gardeners who, once I actually looked into it, they did sort of help the resistance, but in a much quieter way than Bob Armstrong, who just managed to get along. There were also 2 gardeners who hid in attics throughout the whole occupation.
And is there kind of a rule of thumb as to what happened to the cemeteries without their staff? Did some of the local French mow the grass? Were they kind of left? Is there a particular set idea of what happened?
Yeah. So in the spring of 1941, so a whole year into the
Mhm.
occupation, the cemeteries were starting to get pretty scraggly. And the mayors didn't like that, and the French government didn't like that. So what they did was the Vichy government provided a small amount of money to mayors and said that the mayors should hire local people to take
Right.
care of the cemeteries. They very often hired the wives or the sons, or in some cases the daughters, of gardeners to do this work, because otherwise the people were on public assistance, and they said, okay, well, we have this money, it's your cemetery, you take care of it, we'll pay you this little bit of money. The standard of care for the cemeteries was never up to Ben Leach's standards. He often complains, and sometimes he was sometimes able to get a letter back to the IWGC in London through like Swiss or American diplomatic channels. And so there are letters from him complaining about the standard of care in the cemeteries, how they're not up
Wow.
to standard, like all of that.
Gardeners, gardeners and their rose bushes and things. We all know a few obsessed gardeners, and it's all the better for it, I guess. No, it's fascinating. So we've got some more questions. So yeah, obviously, one of the things that you said you expanded on the book is the families and extended families, because you then have a little network, and the Gardeners themselves, a lot are interred for the war, but they've got wives, they've got children. Some of the children, I guess, will be adults, and some wouldn't. So Ian is asking, how closely did the Germans watch these Anglo-French families? I mean, were they treated the same as everybody else, or was there an extra level of suspicion because those people have contacts with the enemy?
Yeah, they were quite closely watched in many circumstances. So a few of the wives were interned, especially the British-born wives, but a few of the French-born wives were also interned, although usually briefly and usually in France, not in Germany. That's not a hard and fast rule. There are many exceptions to that. But yeah, they were watched. And some of them, one of the ways that they kept tabs on them was making them check in with the local authorities every week. So there's this one woman in Armentières named Lucy Hollingdale, and she writes about how she lived in a smaller town, and she had to go into Lille every Wednesday to report to the gendarmes in Lille, just to check in and be like, I'm here. And she talks about how she used those trips into Lille to make contact with her resistance network at a cafe that was near the mayor's office, and that's when they would give her the clandestine pamphlets to bring back out into the countryside.
Wow.
So she was actually using her check-ins as a way to say, because foreign nationals were not allowed to go more than 5 kilometers from their houses without a pass, without permission.
Yeah.
And so her having to go into Lille actually facilitated her having a reason to be on the road with her bicycle. Yeah. And lots of other families participated in other ways. There's one teenage son who actually joins the communist resistance, and is in a big firefight a few weeks after D-Day. He was captured, deported, and died in a concentration camp as well.
Wow, so many amazing stories. And another question for me and Carl this time: did some go back to being Gardeners again post-war? I mean, I'm assuming some did, but some felt that maybe they do something a bit safer away from there. So what was the percentage that went back, possibly?
Yeah, so many of them did go back after the war. So there's a big difference between the people who evacuated to the UK and the people who were still in Europe, either interned or free. A lot of the people who were in the UK, especially if their families had gotten out with them, many of them did decide to stay in the UK afterward. They were just like, post-war France was not an easy place to be. They had already done the post-war thing once, right? They had been there in the aftermath of the First World War. And so many of the people who evacuated did decide to stay in the UK. But most of the people who were still in Europe did decide to go back to the commission. In fact, in sort of the fall of 1944 and the winter of 1945, the commission was trying to get back on its feet, trying to send officers back to France. And what they found when they finally got officers back on the ground was that there were 60 men already working in the cemeteries, right? That they had come back. Some of them had come out of hiding. There were also a few of them at another camp at Saint Denis in Paris. So some of the gardeners who were farther south in the just geographically were sent to Saint Denis instead of to Illegate-Tost. And so they were liberated in August 1944 when the Allies got to Paris. And most of them just went back home and started working even before the commission was sort of officially back and officially paying them.
Well, thank you for that. And I can't help thinking myself about what these people, their experiences of this bilingual mixed marriage type, because that's basically what I'm living in right now. I'm a Brit living with a French lady, and my stepkids are French, but they have a British stepfather, and that is something we don't necessarily think of as happening in the 1920s and 30s. But Europe was very cosmopolitan. There were all sorts of different people living in places like Paris and Lisbon, and Berlin, of course, was famously very cosmopolitan international. So this group of gardeners had real insight into those day-to-day dilemmas of where does your loyalty lie. You've got a job that's more of a job. It's a vocation. You're looking, they're, as you said, they're veterans of the First World War themselves. They're looking after the graves of their comrades, their friends, and that's a duty. It's not a kind of clocking in, clocking out kind of job. And so they've got that loyalty, but they've also got loyalty to the country that they are nationals of. They've got community around where they are. It's lots of things to consider. I wonder what they would have been thinking as in the 1930s, that Germany is showing that signs of becoming as we know it became the Third Reich and Hitler and looking to go on a war footing. What experiences they'd have been through and how many dilemmas they faced at that time. Was there much source material for you to look at?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's such a good point, and especially since we don't often think about those small French villages like on the Somme as being cosmopolitan places.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I had to do was read a lot of census records from those places. And what you'll notice is before the First World War, you can read the censuses for every village on the Somme battlefields and never find a foreign-born person. 100% French. Sometimes there's one person in a village who's from Belgium or something, like that is the makeup of the villages. After the First World War, that changes completely. So if you look at the census records in like 1931 and before the Second World War, some of those towns, like Thiepval is 50, almost 50% foreign born. Most of the towns are in the sort of 25, 30, sometimes up to 40% foreign born, because these are towns that were completely decimated during the First World War. A lot of the original inhabitants never came back. And France had a really aggressive immigration policy during the 1920s, where they made it much easier for people to come and gain French citizenship with a shorter residency requirement. They also made it so that if French women married foreign nationals, they didn't lose their French citizenship, but that didn't happen until 1927. So it didn't affect most of the gardeners' wives. But so if you look at a place like Beaumont-Hamel or Thiepval or Albert, like you look and it's Polish names, Italian names, Lithuanians, Spaniards, like so many people from all over Europe are living in these very small towns because of they helped with the rebuilding after World War I and then just stayed. I mean, you do occasionally find. I also read a lot of the escape and invasion reports, and some of my favorites were, you get an American airman who at home spoke Polish or spoke German, because many Americans in that era did speak, were the children of immigrants. And so there are American airmen who evade through France, not by pretending to be French, but by being Polish and speaking Polish to other Polish workers who they meet along the way, because it was these little areas were so cosmopolitan.
This is so fascinating because it's like in my head, after 1919, there's like a reset button pressed and everything goes back to how it was in 1914. But of course it didn't. The borders have changed. Populations have moved. As you say, people have got connections with other places. The romances, babies have been born. Europe was a very different place. And then again, post 45, it does another a non-reset. It finds its level again with all the new communities that have sprung up and population. So it's fascinating. But you mentioned Americans there. So one last question from Scott Grimwood. Does Caitlin know anything about the US First World War cemeteries in the occupied countries?
Yeah, for sure. So the US had a little bit of a different model for their cemeteries in France. They had an American superintendent who would live there, but they mostly employed local French labor.
Right.
So as opposed to the Imperial War Graves Commission, which employed Commonwealth nationals and then had French workers on sort of like temporary contracts, the US, most of the gardening was done by local French workers. Right. And so during the invasion in 1940, of course, the US was still neutral, but they did evacuate the wives and children of all of the superintendents of the cemeteries. Even if you go to the cemeteries now, the superintendent very often still lives on site. If you go to one of the US World War I cemetery, there's a house there where the superintendent lives. And so they were evacuated, and eventually the superintendents were evacuated as well. But some of them did sustain some incidental battle damage in those first battles in 1940.
Well, that's a brilliant presentation. I've enjoyed every minute of it. I can't wait to bring you back on. I can't wait to decide what kind of weird and wacky and cosmopolitan subject you're going to bring to us next time, because this, as we said at the beginning, overlaps so many different areas, and I've sat spellbound through the whole lot. So folks know what to do. Go and buy the book. Help my guests by buying their books, and help me by becoming a patron or YouTube channel member. And Caitlin, it's been great talking to you. I hope our paths cross again.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
Thank you. So, folks, I'm back again later on talking about the airborne troop carrier plan for D-Day. So that'll be later on. So cheers, everybody. See you in a few hours' time. This is Paul Winnett for World War II TV saying enjoy the next 2 or 3 hours without me. Cheers, everybody. Bye.